I'm going to do a quick head-to-toe assessment and see what's going on with Chad. Again, I want to address the bleeding first. What I do take note of immediately is coming out of his nose. This is called cerebral spinal fluid. That is fluid coming out of the nose or the ears. It could be bloody and it could be mixed with fluid, kind of a white, milky fluid. What happens here is when there's a head injury or a gunshot to the head, the brain expands. There's fluid around the brain called cerebral spinal fluid. There's no place for this fluid to go when the brain expands. So what happens is it'll come out of the nose, it can travel up through tubes called eustachian tubes and come out of the ears. This is the type of bleeding that you don't want to control. Chad's brain is swelling and blood is getting pushed out of his nose. Clear fluid is getting pushed out of his ears. We want to let this bleed. Your body will reproduce that cerebral spinal fluid. So this is a key and tells us that Stephanie's providing spinal immobilization is very, very important. And what I'm looking at here is looks like a chest injury. I need to expose a little bit further, and I'm going to cut that area. Again, if you have a knife and you have to cut it to expose it, you'll do that. So I'm going to cut and expose this area here. It looks like he's got a bullet wound to the chest here, and there's some blood coming out of it. Now what I notice here is there's a little bit of a red mark down on the bottom. What happens when a projectile hits a person at an angle is if it hits them straight on, it's going to make pretty much a perfect hole. But depending on what that projectile does, whether it wobbles or oscillates or it hits Chad at an angle, it's going to cause a little bit of an indentation. So we know that this is an entrance wound. There's another thing I know about this wound as well. If you notice this black area, this speckled, this is called tattooing. What happens is when somebody is shot from a close proximity, the muzzle blast comes out and tattoos around and causes these black marks, sometimes brown, sometimes black. So we know that this is an entrance wound. We've got a bigger problem here though. Chad is having difficulty breathing, and I can see that there's blood coming out of this. What's happening here is right behind Chad's chest here, his lungs are sitting there, and when the bullet wound goes in, what can happen is that when Chad is breathing, air is leaking out of his lungs and into this space right here. So what happens is the air leaks into this space, it's called a pleural cavity, and it puts pressure on the lungs. And as more air leaks into this space, the lungs start to squeeze closer and closer together. So we need to close this up right away. In essence, what we need to do is make a one-way valve. We need Chad, when he inhales, to put all that air into his lungs and exit out of this bullet wound. Because what's happening is he'll breathe in, the lungs will expand, air will come out. When he exhales, the air goes back in and keeps putting pressure on the lungs. So we're going to do something called an occlusive bandage. There's two ways of doing this. The homemade occlusive bandage is to take a piece of foil. In the military, they said to use your ID card, a piece of wax paper, or anything that you can use. An occlusive bandage is in essence a one-way valve. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to lay this down over his chest, and I'm going to tape this down. So what's happening here is as Chad inhales, the air is getting pressed in from his lungs, it's getting pushed out of that hole, and it's coming out through this flapper valve of sorts. And then it hopes that when he exhales, that the air doesn't go back in there. Now there is a certain condition. What'll happen is if he starts to get better, we know it works. Sometimes there's something called a tension pneumothorax, and what that means is that the lung tissue also has a hole in it, and what's happening there is the air is not only leaking out of this hole and back in, but it's leaking through the lungs into this pleural cavity, and it's collapsing his lung. So what'll happen there is his condition will get worse. The only way to treat this is, because you don't know if it's a tension pneumothorax or a simple thorax as we call this, is to put an occlusive bandage over this and watch Chad and see how he's breathing. I can perform my head-to-toe assessment. And 3 to 4 minutes, I want to again take note on how he's breathing. If his condition gets worse, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and take this occlusive bandage off and just let as much air come out as possible. If he starts to breathe better, then your occlusive bandage is working. Anytime we suspect neck injury, we roll this person as little as possible. Again, if it's an emergency situation, we're going to roll them. But if we do have the ability, the time, we can actually put a spine board here in Chad and put him on that spine board, and we're going to tape him to that board and transport him. But if you're out in a rural area and all you have is a vehicle and no way to call 911, you're going to have to drag good old Chad here into your vehicle and move to the hospital. So there's no simple way to do this. If you have to throw them over your back and stick them in the back seat of the car, that's what you're going to do. The best bet is if you can get EMS, if you can get an ambulance or a helicopter here, and they'll have all that equipment to take care of them. If you don't, you do what you got to do. In an emergency situation, you got to make do with what you got. It's called a critical thinking skill.